Today we'll be making this ring while we talk about soldering. I'll show you all the steps relevant to soldering and more examples as we go along. Before we begin, remember that you are working with fire, so make sure to have a fire extinguisher nearby and protect yourself from the fumes and the chemicals that you're using by wearing a mask. Let's begin. It's probably nothing new to you, but solder comes in many different forms. You have solder wire, solder strips, sheets or paste. The way I'm organizing them, specifically the solder strips, is by using permanent marker and a color code. And I sort them in this little plastic container by type: hard, medium, easy, or even extra easy. When you're starting out with soldering, it can be quite confusing which solder type to use when. So here's the tip. Nothing prevents you to make a plan for yourself. Even if it's a rough sketch, as you see here, you can plan your soldering steps ahead of time. Having a notebook with you at all times is also good if you want to track your materials, your stones, and the time you're taking to make a particular piece. That way, if you need to figure out the price of a jewelry piece that you made, you can. Here, I'm reusing my color code to visualize exactly what I'm gonna do. Today, we're gonna use hard solder for the ring shank and the bezel, medium solder to solder the elements on the backplate, and easy solder in between the ring shank and the backplate. It's a very rough sketch, but you get the idea. And the more you practice, the more these steps will become instinct to you. When I very first started to solder, the way I would picture it was as if I was gluing two pieces of wood together. You'd want a really nice connection. You'd even go as far as to clamping the two pieces of wood to have a very nice joint. Soldering works kind of the same. You want as tight of a joint as you can make it. That way, you'll have the strongest connection as possible. Not only that connection needs to be tight, it also needs to be wide. And by that I mean, if you have only a tiny spot connecting the two pieces you want to solder together, that joint wouldn't be strong enough to hold on in time. So you can help that by filing a flat spot on elements, for example here the ring shank that we're going to use. You can also bind them together with binding wire. Or if you want to make granules like I will, you'd want to melt them onto a flat surface on your charcoal block in order to create a flat bottom on your granule. Do be careful when you are melting granules. It has a tendency to want to dance around. Case in point. In addition, oxidation will act as a barrier against the solder. You need to make absolutely sure that your pieces are clean, free of dust or grease from your fingers. Otherwise, the solder won't flow at all. Imagine a layer of dust onto the wooden blocks. The glue would adhere to the dust and not to the wood itself. It's the same principle for soldering. To summarize, the better the connection between the two elements you'll have, the better the soldering will be. One of the most frustrating parts of soldering, especially in the beginning, is the flux. Specifically, if you have a borax-based flux, it has a tendency to bubble, so your solder chip is going to fly around and you'll have to reset up everything once again. To combat that, you need to solder in 2 steps. First, you're going to melt the borax onto your piece until it has a glassy kind of honey look to it, and then you're going to introduce your solder chip. That way your solder chip won't fly around on you when you're trying to solder, and you're not going to have to readjust mid-soldering. Today we're going to do that for bezel wire. Although we are using gravity to trap that solder chip, so we could get away by doing it in one go. But for demonstration purposes, I'll do it in 2 steps. And we are using hard solder here. And we're also using this technique for soldering the bezel wire onto the backplate. First, we are going to mount the flux. Until it has this glassy finish that you can see here. And then we're going to introduce our solder chips. I'm using 3 solder chips and it is medium solder. So remember to solder in 2 steps. First you melt the borax and then you bring in the solder chip. You've probably heard that saying before, but here's a good example that I had recently. In this, I wanted to solder my bezel wire onto my backplate. Since I was hitting from above and my backplate being significantly bigger than my bezel wire, the backplate took longer to get up to temperature. So when the solder flowed, it flowed onto the wall of the bezel wire. As soon as I saw that, I brought the flame under my backplate to try and pull the solder down, as you can see here. Also, when you're soldering, be aware of the volumes of the elements that you want to solder together. Here's another good example. When I tried to solder this wire onto my backplate, I started heating up directly from above. But the backplate being so wide, the heat got dispersed within it, and the wire got up to temperature way faster than the backplate did. So when the solder flowed, it flowed first onto the wire, and then in between the wire and the backplate. In the beginning, one of the easiest and most useful technique that you can learn is sweat soldering. Essentially, you want to pre-melt your solder onto one element and then bring the whole piece together. You can do this for decorative elements, like these moons. I melted the solder onto the moons first and then brought it onto the necklace. Or you can use that technique with jump rings. Or even wire. Not only it removes the fiddling with the solder chips, but it helps with the cleanup. You won't have a puddle of solder to clean up afterwards. To show you this technique with our ring today, I pre-melted medium solder onto the backplate. And next, I carefully placed my granules. Because the solder is already on, I can focus more easily on the symmetry and the placement of the granules. And because I'm going to cut out the backplate, there won't be any trace of solder onto the granules or the bezel. Binding wire is a great tool to use when you want to assure yourself that the connection you have between your elements is the best possible. I really like using this technique for projects such as these, because I'm never too sure if the square wire can move or warp under the heat. You can also use binding wire to elevate your piece so you can heat from underneath. If you don't have a third hand, like this one, you can use these kinds of paper clips to hold your tweezers. I really like using them at the end of my tweezers to create an effect of balance, especially for soldering ear posts. On this example, as soon as the solder flows, the ear post will drop into the solder, creating a perfect seam. And for our ring, we're going to use this technique to solder the ring shank onto the backplate. But as much as the tweezers are great to hold your work, they are also heatsink. They will absorb the heat away from the joint you're trying to make. And as bad as that is, you can use this property to your advantage. I always use this when I'm trying to solder jump rings onto necklaces to prevent the heat from going onto either the chain or the clasp. And because there is a tiny spring in the clasp that can be damaged under the heat, I'll usually place a second pair of tweezers in front of the clasp in between my flame and the clasp to protect it from the heat even further. Lastly, as much as we've heard before that solder will not fill gaps, well, that's quite not true. In my work, I really like adding decorative cuts, and I'll usually use an 8/0 blade to do that. The problem is, this is such a tiny cut that the solder will absolutely flow into it. I've learned that the hard way. If you want your metal to be clean for the solder to flow, you can also make your metal dirty for the solder not to flow. In this little test, I've cut out in a piece of copper 3 lines. One will be left as is. One will be protected by a 4B pencil. And the last one will be protected by yellow ochre. In my case, it's Winsor & Newton yellow ochre watercolor. I heard about the yellow ochre recently and I wanted to put it to the test. I put the solder on it as if I would sweat solder the piece. And as you can see, the results are quite clear. Solder flowed in the unprotected cut, and the 2 others were safe. Although, in my opinion, the 4B pencil worked better. I was soldering the Warblooms earrings recently, and well, it didn't go quite as planned. I wanted to sweat solder this tiny piece onto the bigger piece, so I melted my solder, nothing wrong. Soldered the first earring, nothing wrong. When I went to solder the second earring, I noticed that I was putting a lot more heat than what would be required for my solder to flow. It was hard solder, by the way. And I noticed the whole piece starting to get really red, almost to the melting point. And you can see here that on the very top, something melted. I pulled my flame away, waited a few seconds, tried again, and same thing. Something melted on the top, and I didn't see the solder flow. So I stopped. I took a break, quenched, pickled the piece, and I figured what my mistake was. The tiny piece with the solder on it, I put it upside down. So that was the solder melting and not the actual silver. I corrected my mistake and the solder flowed perfectly. If someone tells you that the first time they picked up a torch, everything went perfectly, they're lying. We've all made mistakes, we've all melted many projects. Not only it could, but it will happen to you. So, be patient with yourself. Continue to practice, and you'll get there eventually. Let me know if you want me to go into more details about any topic that I've talked about in this video. And if you have any questions, please feel free to ask them in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.